Hello, everyone. It's great to be here with Garth Glissman, Associate Vice President of Basketball Operations at the NBA. Garth is here today to talk about the 2021 NBA pre-draft process and to also provide some details regarding the NBA's Undergraduate Advisory Committee and how it pertains to our NCAA men's basketball student athletes who are interested in testing the waters. And I not only have the pleasure of talking with Garth today, but also have the opportunity to collaborate with Garth throughout the year on issues that relate to our men's basketball student athletes' involvement in the NBA's pre-draft process. Garth, welcome and thanks for joining us today.
Joe Brina, thanks for having me. And on behalf of my colleagues at the NBA League office, we have appreciated the partnership over the years, in particular as it relates to the pre-draft process. And seemingly like everything in our society over the last year, this year's pre-draft process will be a little different. For one, some key dates still need to be finalized, including the actual date of the 2021 NBA draft and the format and dates of the draft combine. And two, there are some new NCAA and NBA rules that will be in effect this year due to the ongoing coronavirus pandemic, which brings me to an important note that for players, coaches, parents, compliance officials navigating the pre-draft process, it's really important that they understand the overlap between both NBA and NCAA rules. And that's really what we hope to accomplish with today's session. But also, as I said at the top, recognizing that there are some uncertainties and some dates still need to be finalized with this year's pre-draft process. It will require ongoing education in the coming weeks. And so we look forward to partnering with you and your colleagues on that. And my message to the college basketball community would be continue to stay tuned for more important information.
Thank you, Garth. And you mentioned how the NBA rules and processes and NCAA rules and processes are somewhat intertwined as it relates to the pre-draft process, and also how things just look a little bit different this year. As you know, one of the steps that the NCAA took this year to address the impact of the pandemic on our student athletes in their collegiate season was to generally allow schools the ability to give student athletes an additional year of eligibility. Did that decision have any impact on the pre-draft process?
You're absolutely right, Joe Brina, and I'm glad that we're starting there. The most significant development in this year's pre-draft process is the NCAA's decision to grant all current Division I men's basketball student athletes an extra year of eligibility. And as a result, all current college players will be treated as underclassmen for purposes of this year's pre-draft process. And I think for coaches who have been through this process before, as well as compliance officials, conceptually, hopefully that makes things a little bit easier to understand. In the past, there's one track for underclassmen and a separate track for outgoing seniors. This year, everybody is in the same bucket, and regardless of how many years they may have been on campus, everybody will be effectively treated as an underclassman by virtue of the NCAA's decision to grant an extra year of eligibility. And as part of this process, that means two things. First, all current college players can apply for feedback from the NBA Undergraduate Advisory Committee. We'll get into some of those details later, as you mentioned, Joe Brina. And then secondly, because we're treating all student athletes in this process as underclassmen, that means entering the draft this year will require, or any college player wanting to enter the draft this year is actually required to submit early entry paperwork, which is different than in a normal year when that process is only required of college underclassmen, and college seniors are automatically eligible for the draft in a normal year. But again, this year is different because every men's basketball student athlete has another year of eligibility, so nobody's automatically eligible. And again, that means everybody is able to apply for feedback from the Undergraduate Advisory Committee. And to the extent they ultimately want to make the decision to enter the draft or test the waters as an early entry candidate, they need to fill out the appropriate paperwork.
Thank you, Garth. That's a really important note, the distinction between the Undergraduate Advisory Committee request and then also entering your name into the draft. I know we've had some confusion on that in previous years, that they are two separate processes that a student athlete would have to actually take. And then this year, even more important, because of the potential for that additional year, those current men's basketball student athletes who would have otherwise completed 4 seasons of eligibility prior to this year's draft. It's a little bit of a change for them in terms of entering their name into the process.
Well, you make a good point, Joe Brina, and that is applying for the UAC it's fairly non-binding in the sense that you can get feedback, but it doesn't tie you to actually entering the NBA draft as an early entrant. You can seek UAC feedback, and many student athletes do, in fact. About, we'll call it 75% last year, roughly, decided to seek UAC feedback and then didn't even take the step of entering the draft to test the waters as an early entry candidate. But the flip side of that is that applying for feedback for the Undergraduate Advisory Committee does not automatically enter a player into the draft. So if a player ultimately wants to take the step of entering the draft, that requires submitting additional paperwork, a second track of paperwork to the NBA League office. And in a separate educational session with you, Jabrina, my colleague Wes Harris will walk players, coaches, and compliance officials through that process. But it's really important to keep in mind that it's 2 separate processes, 2 separate sets of paperwork. You have the Undergraduate Advisory Committee on one hand, and then on the other hand, you have the early entry process.
We've talked a lot about this pre-draft process. And so in terms of timing, for a men's basketball student athlete who is actually interested in exploring his professional basketball opportunities, what's the typical time frame to start that process? And what are some of the first steps in the pre-draft process?
As a general rule of thumb, the pre-draft process starts when a student athlete's team completes their season. And when I say complete their season, that's inclusive of any conference tournament, NCAA tournament, or NIT games. So once their team completes the season, they are eligible to apply for feedback from the Undergraduate Advisory Committee. We have already distributed to all Division I head coaches and all senior men's basketball compliance officials an Undergraduate Advisory Committee application. And so once a student athlete's season is complete, they can submit that application to us. The application window is open until Monday, April 12th. And so at any point between the end of a student athlete's season and April 12th, they can apply for feedback from the Undergraduate Advisory Committee. And then we provide feedback to the student athletes after having surveyed all 30 teams. One question we often get is whether student athletes can apply for UAC feedback after the deadline. Again, this year's deadline to apply for Undergraduate Advisory Committee feedback is Monday, April 12th, which is roughly a week after the NCAA Men's Division I National Championship game. The answer is that working in consultation with the NCAA, generally we do accept applications for UAC feedback after the deadline, but it can impact the timing of when the student athlete receives feedback, and applying late to the UAC can create separate issues for a student athlete under NCAA rules. So if under any circumstance, if you find yourself as a student athlete or as a coach or a compliance official, one of the student athletes at your institution finds himself applying for feedback late after the UAC deadline, the best advice is to call both Joe Brina at the NCAA National Office and call me at the NBA League office to make sure that we provide an overview of where things stand in the process at that time and help identify any relevant issues.
You've talked a little bit about the Undergraduate Advisory Committee evaluation, and it's clearly a very important step in the pre-draft process under NCAA rules because it is a required step before a student athlete, a men's basketball student athlete, enters his name into the NBA draft, should he also want to preserve his NCAA eligibility. Can you provide us with a little bit more detail about the committee and the actual evaluation process?
Sure. Well, you're exactly right, Joe Brina, that in 2019, the NCAA modified its rules around the pre-draft process. And since that time, under NCAA rules, student athletes who wish to test the waters, enter the draft as an early entry candidate, and still wishing to preserve the possibility of returning to school, they first have to seek undergraduate advisory committee feedback. And since then, we've really worked closely with you, Joe Breen, and your colleagues at the national office, as you know, to provide educational outreach to the college basketball community so they understand how these rules interact. I do want to make clear that under NBA rules, undergraduate advisory committee feedback is still only optional. So under NBA rules, it's not a requirement that a player would seek UAC feedback before entering the draft. But what the UAC is intended to do, first and foremost, is to help men's basketball student athletes make informed decisions at a very important time in their lives. And we find that the more we can educate student athletes, their coaches, players, family about the process, the more comfortable they become. So the UAC has actually been around for quite a while, over 20 years, in fact, but we continue to enhance the educational outreach. It consists of senior basketball executives from all 30 NBA teams and is managed by the NBA League office. What we do when a student athlete applies for feedback from the Undergraduate Advisory Committee is that we submit that name to teams, all 30 teams, in fact, and we ask those teams to identify where they believe that player is most likely to be drafted in that year's draft. We're not making an assessment as to how that player might project longer term. We're not making an assessment of that player's strengths and weaknesses on the basketball court. We are simply asking our 30 teams, and those are the teams that essentially decide whether a player is ready to enter our league by virtue of who they select in the draft, who they offer free agent contracts to for those players who aren't selected in the draft. So those are the 30 organizations that matter, and we go to them and we ask them to provide us with feedback as to where they see that particular player if he's inclined to enter that year's draft. We then take that information, compile it, we de-identify it, and aggregate it for the student athlete and provide him with that feedback in writing, which is a new feature, Joe Brina. For many years, for coaches, for college coaches who have been around this process, they know that all of this used to happen over the phone. And that provided some relationship benefits. I think college players and coaches enjoyed the conversation with folks at the league office. But based on feedback from the coaching community, we learned that we could do a better job of providing feedback that is more clear and more actionable. And so this will now be the third consecutive year that we make sure that every UAC applicant receives feedback in the same standard written form that provides them with an indication of where, based on the surveying of all NBA teams that we've done, that player is most likely to be drafted. And then we also actually share, again, on a de-identified basis, the vote breakdown so that a student athlete will know that, hey, maybe 40% of teams think that I'm going to be selected in the first half of the second round. 40% think that I'm going to be selected in the second half of the second round, but there are, and maybe I should be a little focused on this, there are 20%, for example, that think I will go undrafted. So we try to operate with optimal transparency. We try to provide that information in a straightforward fashion. This will be the third year that we've done it. And since we made that adjustment, Joe Brina, in conjunction with some of the NCAA rule changes in 2019, the feedback from the college basketball community has been very positive.
Thank you for walking through that information. That's a very detailed process, and it sounds like the information that's gathered by the teams and provided to the student athletes who make that request is very useful and hopefully really helps the student athlete decide whether or not he should return to school or whether his best option is to keep moving through the pre-draft process. The last question, Garth, I have for you today is regarding that information. So if you have a student athlete who goes through the process and requests that feedback, if they have questions about what they receive, is there educational materials or someone that they can contact to get a better idea of what's in front of them, what they're looking at, and any additional feedback?
Absolutely. And I'm going to circle back to answering that question, Joe Brina, but I want to provide a little additional context by framing the timing of when they can apply for feedback and when might be the best time to ask those questions. So I mentioned earlier that the pre-draft process effectively starts when a men's basketball student athlete's season concludes. The UAC application deadline this year, as I mentioned, is April 12th. That date is set on our calendar. What is still to be determined at this point is the NBA's early entry deadline. And the reason that is to be determined is that as of the date of us filming this particular educational session, Joe Brina, which is March 17th, we have not set the date of the NBA draft. However, once that date is set, once the NBA draft date is set, the NBA's early entry deadline, based on the current language of our collective bargaining agreement with the Players Association, will be 60 days before the draft. So men's basketball student athletes can apply for UAC feedback. They can take the information they get back from the committee, talk to their coaches, talk to their family, and decide whether or not they ultimately want to enter the draft. They have to make that decision no later than 60 days before the NBA draft. Once that date comes, they have to decide whether or not they want to enter the draft, and to use NCAA terminology, test the waters. Once they enter the draft as an early entry candidate 60 days prior to the NBA draft, they still have the opportunity under NCAA rules to withdraw. And under NCAA rules, the time to withdraw is typically 10 days after the conclusion of the NBA draft combine. Now, that date also to be determined at this point, Joe Brina, as you know, because we have not set the dates or the format of the 2021 NBA draft combine. But once we do that, that will provide more clarity as to when the NCAA's withdrawal deadline will fall. So those are the key dates and the timeline to kind of understand the broader context. So in terms of when we hear from the college basketball community the most in terms of trying to get some additional feedback, it typically falls at one of two times or both. We hear a lot from student athletes and coaches prior to the NBA's early entry application deadline, again, 60 days before the draft. And we hear a lot from student athletes while in the process of applying for feedback from the Undergraduate Advisory Committee. But again, the Undergraduate Advisory Committee process is intended as a build-up to the early entry deadline. It really is intended to help student athletes decide whether or not they want to test the waters or perhaps enter the draft and make that decision final. And so there's a lot of conversation around that time. They can always reach out to the league office. We're happy to have phone calls with coaches, with compliance officials, with the student athletes themselves. They can reach out via email for rule interpretations, or if they have questions about the details surrounding the UAC process. The UAC email account at the NBA league office is uac@nba.com. Again, that's uac@nba.com. So we are open for business, happy to talk, happy to help. A lot of conversation typically occurs, again, around the time that student athletes are applying for UAC feedback, deciding whether or not to enter the draft as an early entry candidate. And then things typically quiet down for a little bit and get active again, leading up to the combine and then the NCAA early entry withdrawal deadline, which is 10 days after the conclusion of the combine. And for those student athletes who have remained in the draft through the conclusion of the combine, they actually get updated written feedback from the Undergraduate Advisory Committee. So for student athletes who remain in the draft throughout the entirety of the pre-draft process, they will get 2 rounds of written feedback from the Undergraduate Advisory Committee. The first round they will receive prior to deciding whether or not to enter the NBA draft as an early entry candidate. And then the second round of feedback they'll get reasonably in advance of when they need to decide whether or not they want to definitively stay in the draft, in which case they would forgo the remainder of their NCAA eligibility. So that's when we tend to have the conversations, Joe Brina, but we're always open for business. Folks can call us at any time. As you know, through your good work, we've made those, that contact information available to the entire college basketball community. Call or email. And again, the UAC email address, kind of one-stop shopping for anyone with questions about the UAC, is uac@nba.com.
Thank you, Garth. And that's a good reminder. You've mentioned it a couple of times, the additional resources that are out there for people if they need some additional information. You talked about the UAC email address, and obviously you and your colleague Wes, who we'll talk with here in a moment, a little bit more about the draft and details surrounding that. We also have a lot of information that we collaborate with you guys on our ncaa.org website. That speak more generally to the NBA pre-draft process, but also highlight a lot of the things that we talked about today. We do hope these resources are helpful to men's basketball student athletes and those individuals assisting the student athletes through this process. And as Garth mentioned, we'll continue to update those materials as more information becomes available on those key dates and events that are really, really important to this process. So Garth, I want to thank you for your time today and highlighting the information about the NBA pre-draft process, but also giving us some more detailed information about the NBA's Undergraduate Advisory Committee and the evaluation that they provide for our men's basketball student athletes who are going through this process.
Well, thank you, Joe Brina. As I said at the top, we know this is a very important time for the young men who are going through this process, making a decision what to do with their basketball future. Our goal is to provide them with as much objective and accurate information as possible so they can make an informed decision. If there's anything that we can do at the NBA League office to help along the way, please let us know. We're happy to do it.
Thank you, Garth.